The unequal seat. Amara settled into her VIP seat with a sense of comfort that she had grown accustomed to over the years. The plush, extra-wide armrest, the legroom that made long flights bearable, and the soft hum of the engine all combined to offer her a brief escape from the pressure of the work ahead. For a moment, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, mentally preparing for the meetings and deals waiting for her in New York. But as she relaxed into the seat, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from the row behind her. A couple of passengers were chatting animatedly about their trip, and one of the flight attendants was explaining the amenities offered to VIP passengers. Amara smiled to herself, proud of the hard work that had earned her this status, and thankful for the moments of peace it provided before the hectic day ahead. It wasn't long before she was jolted out of her thoughts by the approach of a young flight attendant, a woman with bright red lipstick and a nervous smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly as if unsure of what to expect. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, but we've received a request from a passenger who would like to switch seats." Amara's mind raced. She glanced at the attendant, then down at her ticket, confirming that she was indeed in the right seat. This wasn't the first time a fellow passenger had tried to request a seat change, but it was usually something that was handled without incident. "I'm not sure I understand," Amara replied coolly, her voice steady, though she could already feel a knot forming in her stomach. "Why would I need to switch seats?" The flight attendant hesitated before speaking again, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. "Well, the passenger who has requested the change he is not comfortable in his seat. He's asked if you would consider swapping with him." Amara could feel their patience starting to wear thin. "Who is this passenger?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling that she knew the answer. The attendant cleared her throat and glanced around once more. It's a white male passenger, and he's, quite insistent that he would prefer to sit in your seat." Amara could hear the subtle undertones of what was happening. The request was not only unwarranted, but felt deeply unfair. She had paid for this seat as a part of her business class upgrade. She had earned it through hard work, long hours, and years of dedication to her career. And now she was being asked to give it up simply because a passenger, one who had not made the same effort, felt that her seat was his for the taking. A surge of frustration and indignation bubbled up within Amara, and she stood her ground. "No," she said firmly, her voice carrying an unyielding tone. "I'm not moving. I paid for this seat, and I'm staying in it." The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. "I understand, ma'am, but it's just a request. It would really help us out if you could accommodate him. We want all passengers to feel comfortable, and—" Amara interrupted before she could finish. "If he wants my seat, then perhaps he should upgrade to a better class. I paid for this seat, and I'm not going to give it up for someone else's discomfort." The flight attendant's expression faltered. She seemed to be caught between the pressure of keeping the peace and the recognition that what Amara was saying was entirely reasonable. There was an awkward silence before the attendant, after another brief glance toward the aisle, finally spoke again. "I'll let him know," she said, and with a brief nod, she turned to walk away, clearly relieved that the confrontation hadn't escalated further. Amara let out a long, controlled breath. The whole situation felt strange to her, like something didn't add up. Why had the request come so suddenly? Why was there such insistence on her switching seats? There was something about the entire interaction that didn't sit right, like she had been expected to comply with an unspoken rule of deference. As the attendant walked away, Amara glanced around the cabin. The man in question, a middle-aged, sharply dressed white man, was sitting across the aisle, his eyes not on her, but on the flight attendants who had just left him. She could see him speaking to one of them, gesturing toward the seats, though she couldn't hear the words over the hum of the airplane. But she didn't need to hear them. His body language was enough. He was making his displeasure known. In that moment, Amara realized something deeper about the situation. It wasn't just about a seat. This was about power, about control, about the silent ways in which some people assumed their privilege over others. He hadn't asked. He hadn't requested with courtesy. He had simply assumed that because of who he was, she would move. Amara shook her head, unwilling to let her frustration boil over. She had dealt with this sort of thing before. Subtle, insidious forms of discrimination, the kind that weren't always overt, but were unmistakably present. She looked back at the flight attendant as she approached again, this time with a more subdued tone. "Ma'am, I apologize for the confusion. The passenger has asked if you could please reconsider. He's becoming, well, quite upset." "Upset?" Amara echoed incredulously. "Why should I care if he's upset? I'm sitting in my seat. If he's uncomfortable, perhaps he should find a way to resolve that himself." The attendant nodded sheepishly, but there was little she could say in response. Amara had made her stance clear. As the conversation ended, the flight continued, but Amara's mind remained locked on the situation. What would happen next? Would they continue to press the issue? How far would the airline go to appease this passenger at her expense? She found herself steeling for what was yet to come, her mind working overtime as she mentally prepared for any other challenges that might arise from this moment. But as the plane ascended to cruising altitude, Amara didn't know that the true consequences of this seemingly small incident were only beginning to unfold. The call that changed everything. Amara could still feel the tension in the air as the flight continued its smooth path toward New York. She looked around, half expecting to see the male passenger glaring at her, but he remained seated, a few rows behind her, his body turned away as though trying to ignore her existence altogether. It was as if the situation had simply dissipated, but deep inside, Amara felt a storm brewing. The unease in her gut had not faded. The seed of indignity had been planted, and she couldn't shake it. She tried to focus on the work she'd brought with her. The client presentations, the reports to review, the strategies she had been meticulously preparing. Her laptop sat open in her lap, but she couldn't concentrate. How could she focus on business when the question of respect, dignity, and her own worth was hanging heavily in the air? It was almost as if the flight attendant's polite but forceful insistence had stripped away all the invisible boundaries she usually relied on for comfort. Amara closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of calm. "This isn't about the seat," she told herself. "It's about power, entitlement, and the way some people feel they have the right to diminish others without consequence." The hum of the airplane engines became a distant background noise as Amara's mind wandered. How often had she been expected to just play it along for the sake of politeness, for the sake of keeping things comfortable for others? She was no stranger to being overlooked, underestimated, or even talked over in the workplace. But this was different. This wasn't just an issue of being ignored or disrespected by a colleague. This was a blatant, public challenge to her rights as a paying customer, as a person. She couldn't let it go. She wouldn't let it go. Amara opened her laptop again, but before she could dive into her work, her phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the area code. Chicago, the airline's headquarters. With a deep breath, she answered the call, her mind already preparing for the worst. "Good afternoon, Miss Thompson," came the voice on the other end. It was smooth and professional, but there was something disarming about the tone. "This is Rebecca from Airline Customer Service. I hope you're doing well today." Amara's eyes narrowed as she sat up straighter. She had no idea what this call was about, but she was prepared to stand her ground. "I'm doing well, thank you. How can I help you?" Amara's voice was polite but clipped. "I'm calling in regard to the incident on your flight today," Rebecca said, her words careful, as if she had rehearsed them. "I understand there was a request for you to switch seats, and I'd like to personally apologize for any discomfort this caused." The words sounded rehearsed, but Amara wasn't fooled. She had already anticipated this kind of call, the corporate apology, designed to soothe the situation without actually acknowledging the real issue. She wasn't interested in apologies. She wanted change. "I appreciate the apology," Amara said, her tone more businesslike now. But the issue isn't simply about discomfort. It's about being asked to move from my seat because someone else felt entitled to it. I paid for this seat. I'm not sure what you expect me to do about that." Rebecca's voice took on a slightly more apologetic tone. "I completely understand, Miss Thompson. It's just that we received a request from one of our VIP passengers, a gentleman in first class. He expressed his dissatisfaction with his assigned seat and asked if you could possibly switch. We wanted to resolve the situation amicably, which is why the flight attendants approached you." Amara's grip on her phone tightened. The tension in her chest deepened. A VIP passenger. That was the word that Rebecca kept repeating, as though that made everything okay. Amara knew this had little to do with the comfort of the passenger in question, and everything to do with keeping certain people happy, no matter the cost of others. "I understand that," Amara said, her voice sharp now. "But what you're telling me is that my comfort, my dignity, doesn't matter in comparison to his. And you want me to just accept that. I'm not sure that's something I'm willing to do." Rebecca paused for a long moment. Amara could hear the faint background noise of a busy office, but it didn't distract her. She was intent on listening, on hearing what Rebecca would say next. The silence stretched on, and Amara felt the weight of the situation settling deeper into her bones. "We apologize, Miss Thompson," Rebecca said after a beat. Her voice had changed, now tinged with a sense of nervousness. "We value all of our passengers equally, but sometimes certain requests come from VIP customers that we feel need to be handled delicately. I would like to ask if you'd reconsider your decision and move. I'm sure the crew can find a way to accommodate you in another seat." Amara's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and disbelief. Her voice was cold now, her words measured but firm. "No. I've already made it clear that I won't move. I'm sitting in my seat, and I'm not going to change that. I've paid for this seat, and if your VIP customer is uncomfortable, perhaps he should take it up with the airline, not me." Another uncomfortable silence followed. Amara's chest heaved with frustration, but she wasn't about to back down. Rebecca cleared her throat. "I understand, Miss Thompson. Please let me assure you that this isn't how we normally handle things. I'll pass along your feedback to our team, and I'm truly sorry for any inconvenience this has caused." Amara exhaled sharply. She wasn't sure if she believed Rebecca, but at least the conversation was over for now. "Thank you. Please make sure you understand that I won't tolerate being treated this way again." The call ended, and Amara stared at the phone in her hand, still processing what had just happened. She felt a sense of victory, but it was tempered by an uneasy knowledge that this situation was far from over. She was no longer just a passenger. She had become a symbol, whether she wanted it or not, of the larger, deeper issues of respect and equality that many people, especially people of color, faced every day. She leaned back in her seat, staring out of the window as the clouds parted below. It was hard to focus on anything other than the growing storm of consequences that was now looming on the horizon. At that moment, Amara had no idea how this would all play out, but something told her that the events of this flight would soon spark a chain reaction, one that would ripple far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. The ripple effect. The next morning, as Amara stepped off the plane and into the bustling airport terminal, the weight of the previous day's events still lingered in the back of her mind. It was almost surreal how quickly everything had unfolded. What began as a simple request to change seats had turned into something far larger, far more complicated than she had anticipated. Her instincts had told her to stand firm, to not let the subtle pressure from the flight attendants or the entitled passenger throw her off course. But now, as she stood in the throng of commuters, the chaos of the terminal felt oddly symbolic of the whirlwind that had only just begun. Amara moved swiftly through the crowds, her eyes scanning the surroundings, always aware of the people around her. Her phone buzzed again, and without checking the screen, she knew it was a follow-up message from the airline. She had already anticipated more attempts to resolve the matter. Another apology, another offer to make things right. She had no interest in any of it. The issue wasn't the apology. It was the mindset, the system that had allowed her to be treated as less than. No apology would fix that. Reaching her hotel, Amara decided to go straight to her room and focus on the task at hand. The day ahead was filled with high-stakes meetings, and she couldn't afford to let anything distract her. But as she opened the door to her suite and stepped inside, her mind kept replaying the conversation with Rebecca from the airline. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. There was a voice in her head telling her to let it go, to focus on her work, to move on. But that voice was becoming weaker by the minute. Amara had built her career brick by brick, clawing her way up in a world that often overlooked women, let alone black women. This seat wasn't just a seat. It was the result of years of hard work. The thought that anyone, regardless of who they were, could simply take it because they felt entitled. It was unacceptable. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time she allowed herself to look. The message was from an unknown number, but the subject line sent a chill down her spine. Urgent, VIP customer complaint regarding seat change. Amara clenched her jaw and opened the message. It was from the airline's customer relations team, confirming that her complaint had been forwarded to the senior management team for review. Below that, there was a brief description of the situation from the perspective of the passenger who had made the request to switch seats. It seemed like a standard report, but as she read through the message, she couldn't help but feel a sense of growing frustration. The passenger had given his account of the events, detailing how he had felt uncomfortable and unwelcome in his seat, all the while subtly implying that Amara's refusal had somehow been disrespectful. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. There it was again, the idea that his discomfort, his displeasure, was worth more than her own. The very thought that she was now being framed as the one causing tension only added fuel to the fire. Amara quickly closed the message and took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. This wasn't just a matter of personal injustice anymore. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let something like this slip by. She wasn't going to let this man or the airline get away with turning the narrative in his favor. She decided to act. Amara stood up from the desk and walked over to the window, looking out over the city. The skyline before her was a reminder of what she had worked toward all these years: the promotions, the late nights, the endless meetings. She had earned her place in this world, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. That's when the idea struck her. Why not share the story? Why not use her platform to shine a light on the issue, to expose the casual racism that was so often ignored in corporate spaces? She had a blog that she hadn't used in months, a place where she had previously shared her thoughts on leadership, on self-care, and on overcoming obstacles. It was time to use that platform for something more important, to speak up for herself and for others who had been silenced or overlooked. But as Amara sat down to draft her blog post, something stopped her. She wasn't just writing a piece for her readers anymore. This was something bigger, something more impactful than she had initially realized. This was a story that needed to be told on a larger scale. The injustice she had faced wasn't unique to her alone. It was the story of every black woman who had ever been asked to make herself smaller, to accommodate someone else's sense of entitlement, to silently accept what was being done to her without ever raising her voice. She needed to make her story heard. With renewed determination, Amara began to write. She recounted everything: the flight, the uncomfortable interaction with the flight attendants, the call from the airline, the email from the VIP customer. She described the emotions she felt, the pain of being treated as less than, the overwhelming frustration that came with the realization that her rights and comfort were being dismissed simply because of her race and gender. But she also wrote about her resolve, about how she wouldn't back down, how she wouldn't let this moment define her as a victim. She titled the blog post, "The Seat I Paid For: Standing Up Against the Hidden Racism in Corporate Spaces." As soon as she hit publish, Amara felt a surge of relief. The words had left her, but the process had only just begun. What followed wasn't something she had expected. Within hours, the post was being shared across social media, picked up by various blogs, and even covered by news outlets. Amara couldn't believe how quickly her story had gone viral. People were responding, not just with support, but with their own stories of similar injustices they had faced, of times when they had been expected to quietly accept being mistreated for the sake of someone else's comfort. Amara's blog was resonating with people across the globe. Her story had touched a nerve. It wasn't just about her experience. It was about something bigger, a system that allowed people in power to disregard those who had been marginalized. And now, people were listening. Within 48 hours, Amara's blog post had been covered by several prominent news outlets, and the backlash against the airline was swift and public. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #SeatPaid4 and #RespectAllPassengers. People were demanding accountability from the airline. The pressure was building, and Amara had become the face of a movement that was gaining traction by the minute. In the midst of this, the airline's corporate office had no choice but to respond. Within a day, Amara received an official apology from the CEO, offering not just an apology, but a promise to review their internal policies and offer further sensitivity training to their staff. It was a gesture of goodwill, but Amara knew that this was just the beginning. She wasn't interested in mere words. She wanted action. She wanted real change. Amara smiled as she read through the apology, but she wasn't satisfied yet. The battle was far from over, standing strong in the spotlight. The days following the viral success of Amara's blog post felt like a whirlwind. The intensity of the media coverage was overwhelming, but Amara remained steadfast in her resolve. Her phone buzzed constantly, with reporters, influencers, and even legal experts reaching out for interviews or comments on her experience. Her inbox was flooded with emails from people thanking her for speaking out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and asking how they could support the cause. At first, the constant stream of attention felt surreal. Amara had never imagined her words would have such an impact. She had written the post for herself, for her own healing, but now it was much more than that. It had become a rallying cry for countless others who had silently endured similar treatment. She realized that her voice wasn't just hers anymore. It represented the collective frustration of people who had been ignored and dismissed for far too long. Amara spent her days juggling interviews and her professional commitments. She had flown to New York for business, but now it felt as though her life had taken a detour. She had become an unexpected spokesperson, a leader in the fight for dignity, respect, and equality. But despite the flood of attention, there was still a nagging feeling in her chest, a sense that this movement was still in its infancy and needed more than just words to make real, lasting change. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling series of interviews, Amara sat in her hotel room, nursing a cup of coffee and reflecting on the whirlwind of the past week. The excitement was fading, replaced by a sense of urgency. The apology from the airline had been a start, but Amara knew that wasn't enough. She couldn't let this moment fade away. There had to be accountability. There had to be change. It was then that she made a decision. "I'm going to meet with the airline's leadership," she murmured to herself. The idea had formed in her mind, and now it felt like a mission. If the airline was serious about making amends, then they needed to understand that words alone wouldn't do the job. Amara wasn't interested in a hollow apology or superficial promises. She wanted tangible change, something that would ensure no one else would have to go through what she had. She wanted policies to be rewritten, staff training to be revamped, and a cultural shift within the company that would set a new standard of respect for all passengers. She contacted the airline's corporate office immediately, requesting a meeting with their senior leadership team. The response came quickly. "We are grateful for your feedback and would appreciate the opportunity to meet in person to discuss how we can address your concerns," the email read. "We will coordinate the details at your earliest convenience." That same evening, Amara booked her flight back to Chicago. She wasn't sure how this meeting would unfold, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let them off easy. She had been given a platform, and now it was time to use it to hold those in power accountable. The day of the meeting arrived, and Amara stood outside the sleek glass and steel headquarters of the airline's corporate office. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding with anticipation. It had been a whirlwind few days, and now, here she was, about to face the people at the top who had the power to make the changes she had been fighting for. Inside, the corporate conference room was cold and sterile, the walls lined with glass that offered a view of the bustling city below. At the far end of the room, a long table sat surrounded by a group of sharply dressed executives, their expressions neutral but attentive. Amara took her seat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. This was no longer just about one seat on a plane. It was about the systemic inequities that affected countless people of every day. The CEO, a tall, well-groomed man named Eric Thompson, began the meeting with a rehearsed smile. "Miss Thompson, it's a pleasure to meet you in person," he said, extending his hand. "We've all read your blog, and we appreciate the candor with which you shared your experience. It's important for us to hear from our passengers, and we take your concerns seriously." Amara shook his hand, but she didn't return his smile. She had spent too many years in corporate environments, where pleasantries were often just a mask for the deeper issues lurking beneath. She wasn't here to be thanked or congratulated. She was here to make sure that what happened to her would never happen again. "Thank you for meeting with me," she replied coolly. "But let's get to the heart of the matter. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because this issue runs deeper than one flight, one seat, or one passenger. It's about the culture that allows this kind of behavior to happen in the first place. It's about the mindset that says the comfort of a VIP is more important than the dignity of the person who is seated next to them, simply because of the way they look." The room grew quieter, the executives exchanging glances. Amara's voice was steady, but there was an intensity to her words that caught them off guard. She had been holding back for far too long. And now, in this moment, she was letting it all out. "We can't keep pretending that these issues don't exist," Amara continued. "What happened to me is a reflection of a much larger problem within this industry. People of color, especially black people, are routinely made to feel like we don't belong, that we're somehow less deserving of the same respect as others. And it's not just on flights. It happens in hotels, in workplaces, in everyday interactions." One of the executives, a woman named Sarah, spoke up. "Miss Thompson, we understand the gravity of the situation, and we're committed to making changes. We've already begun reviewing our policies, and will certainly take your experience into account as we move forward." Amara raised a hand, cutting her off. "Reviewing policies isn't enough. You need to show real commitment. You need to bring in experts who understand diversity, equity, and inclusion to reshape the culture here, from the ground up. You need to ensure that your employees are held accountable when they disrespect passengers based on their race or gender. This isn't about changing one policy. It's about changing your entire approach." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was palpable, each of them processing what she had said. Finally, Eric spoke again. "You're right, Miss Thompson. We've heard you loud and clear. This is a wake-up call, and we're prepared to act. We'll initiate an internal audit, bring in consultants to train our staff, and create a more robust system for handling complaints. We want to be part of the solution." Amara nodded slowly, but she wasn't convinced. "That's a start, but I'll be watching. I'll be keeping track of what happens. This is a long-term commitment, not a one-time fix. You can't just make a few tweaks and call it done." "I understand," Eric replied, his tone more serious now. "We're committed to doing the work, Miss Thompson, and we'll be in touch with you soon with the next steps." As Amara left the meeting and walked out into the cool Chicago air, a small sense of satisfaction washed over her. She had made her point, and the airline had heard her. But this was far from over. The fight for respect, for dignity, for equality, it was just beginning. The winds of change. The days after her meeting with the airline's leadership passed in a blur. Amara spent the next few weeks immersed in meetings with a range of consultants, experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, who were brought in to help overhaul the airline's policies and staff training programs. It was evident that the airline had made a serious commitment to change, but Amara remained cautious. After all, her entire experience had shown her how easy it was for corporations to give lip service without following through with real action. She knew the work had only just begun. Despite her cautious optimism, Amara couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her voice had been heard, and now it was rippling through the corridors of power. The airline's management had publicly committed to the changes they had discussed, pledging to address their internal issues and strengthen their code of conduct. They promised transparency, setting up a publicly accessible platform to track the implementation of new policies. Amara, however, knew that ensuring true accountability meant keeping a sharp eye on every stage of this process. As part of her agreement with the airline, she was granted access to the behind-the-scenes developments. She insisted on frequent check-ins, reviews of updated training materials, and involvement in the process at every level. She wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the airline to fix things. She was going to be an active part of the solution. Meanwhile, her blog post continued to make waves. What started as a personal piece had now turned into a movement. Social media was flooded with reactions, from viral videos of passengers sharing their own instances of discrimination to influencers and activists using her story to shine a spotlight on systemic racism in travel and corporate spaces. Every day, new hashtags were born, new voices joined the conversation. It was clear that Amara's decision to speak out had struck a chord. But it wasn't just the airline that was facing the heat. People were now questioning broader industries about how they treated marginalized communities. The ripple effect didn't stop with the airline. Other corporations, big and small, reached out to Amara for consultations. They wanted to know how to address issues of racial discrimination, how to ensure their policies were more inclusive, and how to create environments where all employees and customers felt valued. Amara was taken aback by the growing number of inquiries. She hadn't anticipated this kind of widespread interest in the work she was doing, but she was determined to use this moment to push for meaningful reform in industries beyond just aviation. Her personal life, however, was becoming more complicated. As her professional life flourished with new opportunities and the attention she garnered from the media, Amara found herself struggling to find balance. She was more visible than ever, but the pressure to represent an entire community was starting to take its toll. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed, unsure if she could bear the weight of it all. She was constantly in the public eye, answering questions from reporters, working with corporations, and making sure her personal story never got lost in the larger movement. In those quiet moments, when she allowed herself a breather, Amara reflected on how far she had come. There had been times in her life when she felt invisible, when she wondered if her voice mattered in spaces dominated by people who didn't look like her. But now, the world was listening, and she had become the voice of something much larger than herself. Still, Amara refused to let the spotlight overshadow the work that had to be done. She worked closely with the airline's leadership and DEI experts, constantly questioning their strategies, offering suggestions, and insisting that any solution had to come from an authentic place. Amara's influence was undeniably shaping the direction of the airline's reform efforts, but she also encouraged them to reach out to others, employees, passengers, community leaders, for their feedback. True change, she believed, couldn't be achieved in a vacuum. As the months went by, the first signs of progress were evident. The airline implemented an updated training program that incorporated real-world scenarios and addressed implicit biases in a more holistic way. Their new policy encouraged active bystander interventions and promoted a culture where passengers were encouraged to report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. On a more symbolic level, they launched an advertising campaign celebrating diversity in the travel industry, featuring people from all walks of life as the face of their brand. But Amara knew better than to rest on her laurels. The real work had to come from the ground up, with everyday employees, from flight attendants to pilots to ground staff, embodying the values of respect and inclusivity that had been promised. That's why she insisted on conducting follow-up evaluations with the airline, demanding not only feedback from passengers, but also anonymous surveys for employees. She needed to ensure that the shift in corporate culture was taking hold at every level. And it wasn't just about the airline anymore. Amara began collaborating with other organizations, nonprofits, and advocacy groups to push for systemic change in the travel industry and beyond. The more people she spoke to, the more she realized how deeply ingrained these issues were. The fight wasn't going to be won overnight, but Amara felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to keep fighting. She was no longer just advocating for herself. She was advocating for everyone who had ever felt marginalized, ignored, or diminished by corporate systems. One afternoon, as Amara stood on a balcony overlooking the city, she took a moment to reflect on how much had changed. The pressure of the spotlight still weighed on her, but it felt different now. She wasn't alone. She had built a community of supporters, allies, and changemakers who shared her vision for a more inclusive world. Together, they were dismantling the systems of inequality that had persisted for so long. Amara's phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a message from the airline's CEO, Eric Thompson. They had reached another milestone: the launch of a new initiative to create a pipeline for underrepresented groups to rise within the company, from entry-level positions to executive leadership roles. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress, Amara knew, was the key to long-lasting change. But even as she read the message, she knew there was more work to do. The winds of change were blowing strong, but they hadn't reached all the corners of the world. There were still voices that needed to be amplified, still systems that needed to be torn down, still spaces that needed to be opened to people from all backgrounds. As Amara continued her journey, she knew that the fight for respect and equality was a marathon, not a sprint. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But she was no longer the quiet passenger in the back of the plane. She was the one who would ensure that everyone, regardless of who they were, had a seat at the table, and a seat that they could truly call their own. The legacy of change. As months turned into a year, Amara's life had irrevocably changed. What had begun as an act of defiance against the airline's unjust treatment had grown into something much larger. The blog post, the media frenzy, the boardroom meetings with corporate executives, all of it had been steps in a long and arduous journey, but now she could finally see the fruits of her labor. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all that was needed to shift the tides of history. The changes she had fought for were starting to take root. The airline had made substantial investments in improving its training programs, with new policies designed to combat discrimination and bias at every level. They were integrating ongoing workshops on cultural competency, ensuring that employees at every tier understood their role in creating an inclusive environment. Flight attendants were now encouraged to intervene and de-escalate situations where passengers displayed discriminatory behavior, and the airline had introduced a clear, confidential reporting system that ensured no passenger or employee felt silenced. But Amara's journey didn't end there. She had always known that true change would take more than just one company's reforms. The systems that enabled discrimination, prejudice, and inequality were vast and entrenched, spread across industries, and woven into the very fabric of society. And so, while the work with the airline was far from over, Amara turned her sights outward. It was time to amplify her efforts. A few months after her meeting with the airline, Amara was invited to speak at a major industry conference on diversity and inclusion in travel and hospitality. The event, held in Washington, D.C., gathered executives, policymakers, and thought leaders from around the world to discuss how to address systemic inequality within their industries. Amara had been invited as both a guest speaker and a panelist, a recognition of the work she had done to shift the conversation around racism in the travel space. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights above her felt like a spotlight, not one of warmth, but one that drew every eye toward her. She was used to speaking in front of audiences by now, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about the collective stories of every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong. It was about the generations of people who had been kept out of spaces because of the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, or the accent in their voice. Amara cleared her throat and took a deep breath before she spoke. The room fell silent. Change doesn't come from a single action or from a single voice. It comes from a collective movement, a series of acts, big and small, that push us toward a world where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, can walk into a room and feel like they belong. She began, her voice steady, but filled with the passion that had fueled her for so long. The fight against discrimination is not just a personal one. It is a fight for humanity itself. And in the face of that fight, we cannot afford to be silent. We cannot afford to sit idly by and hope that things will improve on their own. We must take action. Amara went on to discuss the role of corporations in shaping culture and policy. She spoke about how companies had the power to create environments that celebrated diversity, fostered inclusivity, and held their employees accountable for their actions. But she also emphasized the need for government intervention. She urged policymakers to pass laws that not only prevented discrimination but incentivized companies to prioritize diversity at all levels. Her words resonated deeply with the crowd. By the time she finished her speech, she could see that the room was buzzing with energy. The message was clear. Change could no longer be a distant hope. It had to become a tangible reality. After her speech, Amara participated in a panel discussion with other industry leaders. It was during this session that she made an unexpected connection. One of the other panelists, a senior executive from a major hotel chain, approached her during the break. "Miss Thompson, your talk was inspiring," said Maya, the executive, her eyes gleaming with admiration. "We've been working on similar initiatives at our company, but I think we've been missing something, the kind of systemic change you're advocating for. I'd love to talk to you more about collaborating on this, bringing a multi-industry coalition together to address the broader issue of racism in hospitality." The idea of a cross-industry alliance took hold in Amara's mind like a spark. What if the movement she had started could be expanded to not just airlines, but the entire hospitality sector? Hotels, transportation, retail, tourism. These were all industries where marginalized communities faced barriers and discrimination. The coalition could push for change at every level and ensure that these companies were held accountable for their actions. She wasn't just going to work with one company. She was going to change entire industries. In the months that followed, Amara worked tirelessly to form the coalition. She reached out to allies in the hospitality, retail, and transportation industries. She connected with civil rights groups and organizations focused on racial justice. She used her platform to encourage other influencers to join the fight. Slowly but surely, the coalition took shape. It wasn't easy. There were many hurdles, from competing corporate interests to the slow grind of bureaucracy. But Amara was used to pushing through barriers by now. She had done it before, and she was prepared to do it again. Meanwhile, her own life continued to evolve. Amara had built a small team of passionate activists and consultants who helped manage her growing projects. She had learned to delegate, to lean on her team for support, and to trust that the work she had started would continue even when she couldn't be everywhere at once. One day, while sitting in a meeting with her team, discussing their progress with the coalition, Amara paused. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. She thought back to that moment on the plane, when she had been asked to switch seats. It felt like a lifetime ago. At that moment, she had been hurt and outraged. She had been made to feel small, unimportant. But now, here she was, a leader in a movement that was reshaping entire industries. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said aloud, her voice filled with quiet reflection. "But it happens, one step at a time. And every step we take brings us closer to the world we want to see." Her words echoed in the room, and the team nodded in agreement. They all knew that the road ahead would be long. There would be setbacks, frustrations, and challenges. But Amara had proven that with perseverance, conviction, and the power of collective action, real change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The work was far from over, but Amara had come to understand something fundamental. True leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the voice that inspired others to find their own. It was about creating spaces where people could come together, share their stories, and work toward a common goal. She had sparked a movement, and now that movement was beginning to build momentum in ways she had never imagined. As Amara walked out of the conference room that day, she looked out over the city skyline. There was still much to be done, but she no longer felt alone. She knew that with the help of the allies she had gathered, the movement she had ignited would continue to burn brightly. And no matter how long it took, no matter the obstacles they faced, they would keep moving forward. The future was theirs to shape, and Amara was determined to make sure it was a future where everyone had a place at the table, a seat where they could sit proudly, without fear, without discrimination, and without apology.